Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerd United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. We have, coming back for the second time, author James M. Scott with his new book, Black Snow, Curtis Lemay, The Firebombing of Tokyo and the Road to the Atomic Bomb, out September 6th. As just like the first one, man, he's a great interview. He's got interesting anecdotes. Love this conversation. I'm going to keep bringing him back. Until he tells me no, I'm going to keep bringing him back. Let's not belabor the point. I'm going to shut up. James M. Scott, let's talk to him. All right, here we are. James M. Scott. He has returned to the podcast. First author that has come back with a new book. I'm glad I hooked you the first time. I appreciate you coming back.
Brendan, thanks so much for having me on. It's always a treat to join you for an afternoon.
Well, James, I do have to ask this question. First and foremost, are you willing to accept partial blame for the podcast existing? You pushed me hard last time.
No, look, man, I think it's turned out terrific. So yeah, I'll take all the credit / blame, however you want to phrase it. So yeah.
Because just a little background, the first time we talked, I was just doing the blog at that point, and I told you we're just going to transcribe it and put it up. And your thing was, do a podcast. Why aren't you doing a podcast? Everybody's doing a podcast. And then, I mean, it took a while. Did you start to think, oh, I'm never hearing from this dude again? Or did you always have faith? There is a right answer here.
I always had faith, of course. And but I think it's interesting is that when we talked, I had just come back from a conference where I had heard the one of the podcasters from Dr. Death give a presentation. And I know I left that presentation, A, I've got to listen to Dr. Death, and B, the podcasts are going to be the future. And of course, here we are a few years later. I listen to them all the time. I know you do. I know a lot of your listeners do. It's just such a transformative media. And so congratulations to you for jumping in here, because, as much time as we all spend with our earbuds in and on the road and on, trains and everything else, podcasts are they're awesome. I mean, they're transformative for being able to tell great stories and pass on great history and whatnot. So awesome.
And now it's forced me to kind of learn the technical side of things, which I realized how far behind I am on that. Reading a book and talking about it is super easy. It's literally everything after that takes forever to kind of figure out.
Well, I'm jealous you've done it, because I wish I had those skills, because I really think that this is such a great new media, and it's going to be with us for so long. It's just kudos for you for being out in front of it.
Oh, we're going to set you up. The James M. Scott podcast is now going to be a thing. We're going to fix it. As soon as we stop recording, we're doing it.
Oh, man, I'm on it.
All right. So before we talk about your new book, Black Snow, it's been a while. COVID hit. Anything major going on in your life other than trying to write a book during COVID?
Wow. COVID, actually, I was one of the lucky ones in that I had just finished all of my research for Black Snow when COVID hit. In fact, I was literally actually on a plane. I was getting ready to head over to the Philippines to lead a tour for the National World War II Museum. It was literally on a plane. I'd already flown from Charleston to Washington, was about to take off from Washington all the way to Tokyo when I get this text message from the National World War II Museum being like, we just canceled the whole tour. When you get to the Philippines, just call us and we'll reroute you home. And of course, I was like, oh my God, I really do not want to spend the next 4 days going all the way to Asia and back if I can get off this plane that's on a Washington tarmac. And of course, I jumped up and I grabbed one of the stewardesses and flight attendants. I said, I've got to get off this plane. And of course, he was immediately summoning the air marshal, I think, based on my intensity. And I said, hey, step back, take a deep breath, explain what's going on. And just said, hey, my trip got canceled. And I really don't want to have to go all the way to the Philippines to turn and come all the way back. And he said, we've pulled away from the jet bridge 17 minutes ago. He's like, I don't know what else we can do. He said, but I'm willing to ask the pilot on your behalf. And he said, grab your carry-on, and just in case. I grabbed it. And he comes back minutes later. He said, the pilot's going to pull the bridge and let you off. Wow. So I was able to get off and able to escape having to spend 4 days in a plane going all the way to the Philippines and back. But fortunately, I had just right before that completed all my research. So I spent this couple of years of the pandemic, kids here in the house and all that, hammering out the book. And I also did a master's at the Citadel during that time period as well in military history. So I've been busy despite being locked up for a while.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. You definitely kept busy. And I definitely thought that story was ending with you tasered, but that's all right. We'll get some action later on.
It came perilously close to that.
Well, especially when we last talked, I mentioned that you love doing events around your book. Like you want to be immersed, especially in anything like you were talking about. Did COVID drive you nuts like everybody else? Or were you able to say, because you're sitting down and writing, you're like, I'm just going to block it all out anyway?
I did. I definitely had some cabin fever. In fact, I think everybody did. I'm fortunate that I live here in Charleston and we have the Citadel really right in my backyard, which is a great military history institution. And so I was able to say, hey, all that time I would normally be spending, doing talks and meeting with readers and stuff, I'm just going to channel that into going back to school. And so, which was great because, a lot of my classes were on at night and whatnot. So I could work during the day and then go to these just awesome class sessions and, read over 100 different books that I might not otherwise have read. And it was just a really awesome opportunity to sort of enrich myself. And I didn't do any World War II. And that was the whole point. I said, look, I live and breathe World War II. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it completely separate from what I do. I did the American Civil War, the French and Indian War, military intellectuals, military thinkers. I mean, just a wide variety. So it was great. I mean, I always say it was kind of like turning lemons into lemonade.
Now, should I expect that after Black Snow, we might have something completely non-World War II?
No, I'm right back in the trenches on it. It's kind of, you write what you know, and I've spent all these years, studying the Pacific War, and that's where all your ideas come out of when you're working on. I mean, Black Snow, for example. I got the idea for this 2 books ago when I was working on my submarine book, and some of the guys I was writing about were stuck in Tokyo in a prisoner of war camp when the firebombing happened, and I remember thinking at the time, wow, I need to come back and revisit this. And here we are, 10 years later, right back with that story. So.
Well, September 6th, Black Snow, Curtis LeMay, The Firebombing of Tokyo, and The Road to the Atomic Bomb. One thing that I do love about this is I don't think we have to worry about spoiler warnings. I think even non-history nerds know we won the war. Sorry, spoiler alert if you didn't know, and that we dropped atomic bombs. So jump back. You just mentioned it. Where did this idea come from? And how do you decide that this is the book where you're going to sit down and really do it, right? Because it's one thing to have an idea, and it's another thing to say, this is a full-on book that I'm going to do.
You're right. And I'll tell you this, whenever I'm kind of making that decision, I mean, one of the biggest things that kind of weighs on me is this is going to be a topic that I'm going to live and breathe for 2 or 3 years or 4. I mean, I'm going to get up every day and have to be excited to go sit in my computer, go through documents, do interviews and all that. So it has to be a topic that can carry on that energy. And so when I was actually working on my submarine book, The War Below, which came out back in 2013, I believe, I was writing about a group of American submariners who were in a prisoner of war camp on a little island in Tokyo Bay called Amori. And so I was going through their diaries and looking at their interviews and things like that. And they all talked about this one raid on the night of March 9th and early morning of March 10th, 1945, in which so much of Tokyo was obliterated. And here they were at this sort of front row seat of this. And my coverage of it in that book amounted to about 2 or 3 pages. And it was immediate even then, looking at the B-29 and sort of the technological evolution of this tremendous airplane and the development of the fire bombs. And then just, of course, the mission itself that, hey, this was just a really unique story that I could see myself getting immersed in. And so I kind of filed that away and the things to come back to later. And so when I'd finished Rampage, after The War Below, I went on, I wrote my book on the Doolittle Raid, wrote a book on the Battle of Manila. And then, I was thinking, all right, what is something that piques my interest? And, that one popped right back up in the top of my mind. And so, wrote a proposal for it, jumped right in. And it's such a fascinating story because it functions on a lot of levels. I mean, the firebombing of Tokyo, of course, it's this transformative raid. I mean, it's one of the most destructive raids of World War II. 16 square miles of Tokyo are destroyed, over 100,000 people killed. It's also a technological story. It's how these American engineers put together this amazing new bomber, the B-29, that's able to sort of bridge these vast distances in the Pacific. And it's a story of diverse leaders. Haywood Hansel, who is the reluctant leader in a lot of ways, who doesn't want to firebomb, and then his successor, Curtis LeMay, who's just this true pragmatist and combat veteran who sees this as the only way to victory. So and then of course, what that does for the American public and how it sort of builds up to the eventuality of the atomic bombings. And so all those things really come together in this one story. And so I think it functions on a lot of interesting levels.
And I would say, I don't think your previous books do this as much, and I don't want to say it like it's too heavy in there, but there is kind of philosophical question that you posit throughout the book, right? Which is, the question usually comes up when we're talking about the bombing of Dresden, but the firebombing of Tokyo here, is this a moral choice that can be made that has, a right answer or a wrong answer necessarily for a lot of those things? Now, I think as you read it, you start to get your point of view on it, but you're not heavy-handed about it. But is that something that you thought about in the beginning? Like, I'm going to kind of put a little bit of philosophy in the background of this as I'm telling a war story?
It's there, whether, however I write the story, that is there. And that's what you have to remember. When I first set out to write this book, I was really kind of thinking, it's just a Pacific War story, but it's not. I mean, the bombing of Tokyo, the roots of this raid really stretch all the way back, not just to the war in Europe, but really all the way back to the birth of aviation in a lot of ways. Because, and it's so important for people to remember that aviation was this incredible new technology at this time. I mean, we think of it today. I mean, I'm about to jump on a plane at 6 a.m. tomorrow and go to New Hampshire, give a lecture tomorrow night. I'll be back in 24 hours. It's no big deal. We do that kind of stuff all the time. But at the time of World War II, I mean, America's air pioneers, I mean, you take General Hap Arnold, okay, who's the head of the Army Air Forces during World War II. He learned how to fly from Orville and Wilbur Wright. I mean, no joke. I mean, this guy, aviation was so new that the Wright brothers taught him how to fly. I mean, the whole reason that early pilots wore goggles was because Hap Arnold had a bug hit him in the eye while he was landing. And you go that within his lifetime, okay, remember, he's the top general, the top air general in World War II. He goes from learning how to fly from the Wright brothers to a 140,000 pound B-29 capable of flying, 4,000 miles across an ocean and raining all sorts of hell and fury upon an enemy nation. I mean, that's how fast aviation evolves during that time period. And as aviation develops, so too do all these other questions arise, which are, how do you use this new weapon? I mean, let's be honest. Soldiers and infantry have existed for thousands of years. Same with navies. And so you have all these ideas and strategies that have gone along with those services, but aviation's brand new. And so figuring out how do you fight this new weapon is something that just absolutely fascinated me, sort of looking at how these early pioneers after World War I and before World War II were really trying to figure out what would aviation's place be in the future of war. And of course, all of those questions play out throughout World War II and lead up to the firebombing of Tokyo. And of course, key to that, to some extent too, is sort of the idea that had developed during this. I mean, like, World War I was just a traumatic experience for infantrymen. You were stuck in these trenches for weeks and months. They were filled with mud. You had, rats. I mean, it was just a miserable, horrible experience. And aviation promised a solution to that. You could leapfrog over these trenches. You could attack the enemy's, factories and whatnot. And the idea being that a nation's economy was like a house of cards. If you pulled out a few key cards, a few industries you attacked, the whole thing would collapse and the war would be over. That was the panacea that people thought it would be. And that's kind of what they envisioned when they went into World War II. And of course, rubber meets the road. Doesn't work out that way. The Germans, of course, far more resilient than people realize. The German fighters start shooting down the British bombers. The British eventually switched from these precision bombing of, trying to knock out key factories to firebombing. The Americans still hold tight to this idea that we're going to be sort of morally superior and we're only going to go after, enemy factories and war industries. And of course, all that goes throughout the whole war in Europe. Of course, that's the backdrop then that we see when the Pacific War starts. And so this isn't just a Pacific War story. This is a story about all of World War II and aviation, and really the birth of aviation as a weapon in so many ways.
Speaking of those weapons, and we mentioned this in the first time we chatted, the Pacific theater does get ignored a lot. So I want to just do a quick compare-contrast. When you see a bomber, anything World War II, you're most likely probably going to see a B-17, the Flying Fortress, the Memphis Belle. Your book takes a deep dive into the B-29, which there were some bugs along the way, which I found absolutely fascinating. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, most people know the B-17. What's the B-29, and how does it kind of change the game?
Well, yeah, I mean, the B-17 is just that iconic bomber. I mean, you think of when you think of the war in Europe, and of course it's the flying fortress. And, the guys are in there and they're wearing heated flight suits and these like fur lined gear and whatnot. And of course the cabins aren't pressurized. You're fighting at 5 miles up in the heavens where the temperatures are 40 below zero. I mean, it's just you're battling the elements as much as you are the Luftwaffe. And of course the B-29 then comes along and it is the B-29 super fortress. So like its name implies, it is bigger. It is a super flying fortress, essentially. It's bigger. It can carry more guns, more payload, all of that. It's the flying fortress on steroids. And it's also really the perfect weapon for the war against Japan, where the distances are just so great. Okay. You can take off from England, from the airfield in England in a B-17, and you can fly to Berlin, drop your bombs, and you can fly back to England. And it's about 1,500 miles. Okay. 1,500 miles is a one-way flight from the Mariana Islands just to Tokyo. So, I mean, the distances here are twice what they are in Europe. And not only that, if you get a bunch of flak damage or fighter damage over Europe, you can bail out and you can hope that you're going to get picked up by friendlies in one of the occupied countries, or at a minimum, you're going to land on land. If you get battle damage over Tokyo and you're having to come back, it's just unforgiving, dark, terrifying ocean all below you. And until we took Iwo Jima in the spring of 1944, you had nothing for that 1,500 miles but prayers to get you home on that. And so that's where the B-29 really comes in. It's a massive bomber. I mean, to give you an idea, the tail of that bomber alone is the equivalent of a 3-story building. That's how high it rises. Its wingspan is 141 feet. That's longer than the Wright brothers' first flight. I mean, just to fill up its fuel tanks takes a railroad tanker car's worth of fuel. And for the airmen, the key factor about this thing that made it different than the B-17 was that it was pressurized. So these men could actually, even though they had these grueling long missions of 15, 16 hours, they were at least in a pressurized cabin. So, I mean, one of the guys said in one of the oral histories said, hey, we could fly it in our T-shirts. And so the comfort level was at least that much better than in the B-17. But it really was, I mean, bringing this new bomber from a drawing board to a potential war-winning weapon was just an extraordinary story in and of itself. I mean, it was a Boeing-designed plane and built, and we put that thing into production before we even knew if that thing could fly. And just as you can imagine, I mean, we built about 4,000 of them over the course of the war. To build a plane with 55,000 parts and more than 12 miles of wiring and whatnot, this sophisticated of a weapon, I mean, we ended up literally building an entire new city in Kansas called Plainview, Kansas, just to house this army of workers needed to be able to put this thing together. And of course, the fascinating thing is engineers had to be able to break it all down so that people with just a middle school education at best, in some cases, could actually help fabricate this thing. So, I mean, it's really just it's a technological story as much as it is a war story in a lot of ways.
I mean, it's political too, right? There are a lot of people's jobs were relying on the B-29 making it out there. And in comparison to the B-17, right, you can do a lot of compare and contrast. But one of the things with the B-17 is that thing always just went. It got beat up, it got tore up, and it just did its job 24/7. Where the B-29, there was up until the point where it finally got in the air and everything started going well, they didn't know if they were even going to be able to take off when they showed up on the airfield.
And exactly. And you got to remember, we had the B-17 before the war started. So, I mean, American pilots were flying on those in the late 1930s. And so there was a lot of time to work out the kinks and sort of fix the armor and fix, things like that. I mean, the B-29, like the first few ones that rolled out of the factory went straight to the war zone. And of course, as you can imagine with a plane that this technologically advanced for its era, it's going to have some issues. And the problem is you don't want to be working those issues out when you're somewhere stuck over an ocean between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo. And that's exactly what they had to do. The engines on these things notoriously caught fire. I mean, Paul Tibbets, who's the famous pilot of the Enola Gay, once said, you could hardly get one of these early B-29s off the ground before one of the engines caught on fire. You look at the great photographs in the National Archives, and when they're preparing these things for takeoff, there's always guys on the ground with fire extinguishers under each engine. I mean, it's just... And you're a crew member getting ready to get on board that plane, and you got to be thinking, seriously? This is what I'm trusting my life to? And I mean, and these issues did wear down the morale of these early airmen having to fly these missions, and they were, here they are all the way over in the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, trying to work out the kinks of this plane, whilst fighting a war, while having the Japanese raiding the islands, while still having rogue Japanese troops taking pot shots at you. I mean, that whole stew of issues just creates this massive amount of tension and stress on these first early airmen in late 44 and early 45.
All right, so we checked off the equipment. Let's talk about the leaders in charge of this thing.
Yeah.
Start off with Haywood Hansel. General has done a lot of great things in Europe and then heads on over to the Pacific. He's talking about, right, a different type of tactic, which is the one they're using in Europe, and they're saying, certain people are saying it's not going to work in the Pacific. One of the things that we have to talk about, because we do get to Curtis LeMay, is just from your writing standpoint, Haywood Hansel doesn't make it through as far as he ends up getting replaced. We kind of know that early on. I'm not giving away too much. How do you write fairly for somebody who is a hero in a lot of ways, but ends up being kind of a failure in this particular aspect of his career? How do you write that fairly?
I have a lot of respect for Haywood Hansel, and I say that, he's obviously deceased. And so it's not like I ever had an opportunity to meet him or interview him, but I've spent a lot of time with his personal papers. His personal papers are on file in the Air Force Archives down at Maxwell Base and also in the library at the Air Force Academy out in Colorado. And so, I mean, I feel like I know him in so many ways because I've spent just months and months reading his letters, his speeches, his combat reports, and things of that nature. And so I have a lot of respect for him. He was an early aviation pioneer. I mean, he was a product of the air school at Maxwell Air Force Base when these early guys were starting to figure out, how are we going to fight a war using aviation? And he, of course, was a big proponent of using high altitude precision bombing, which he felt was morally superior to just firebombing things. That was the whole idea of coming in and sort of pinprick bombing, knock out a few factories, collapse the whole economy. And he was, and he really relished those kinds of analytical exercises and whatnot. I mean, he was an academic at heart. He was a planner, a thinker. He was not a predator. So where he did not succeed was in running combat missions. And that's where he really struggled. He struggled that way in Europe for a large part. And then he also struggled when he came over to the Pacific War as well. But that's not to say that, I mean, his ideas weren't, that you couldn't respect him and that you couldn't see where he was going with his different ideas and all. And so he also was had been chief of staff for General Hap Arnold, so he was well connected. I mean, he had friends. He was, he'd been a fighter pilot early in his career. He had flown with Claire Chennault at early days doing acrobatics and whatnot. So, I mean, he was just a true believer in high altitude precision bombing, and it ultimately was his downfall because he was unable to adapt when he got to the Pacific, and he gets over there and he runs into a whole different combat scenario than he'd experienced in Europe, a whole new airplane, greater distances, his bases weren't yet developed. And then he's running into terrible weather over Japan, which of course is a unique factor to Japan. And of course, these terrific jet streams that nobody realized that Japan happened. And of course, all these factors, and he proves unable to change. And as Lemay once famously said, he said, look, every time you cross into the enemy's airspace, you've punched your ticket. Whether you hit your target or not, you have paid your price of admission. And that price of admission can be incredibly costly for those men who do not come back. What you don't want to have to do is come back repeatedly. And that's what was happening to Hansel. He wasn't hitting his targets. His philosophy wasn't working. His men they were flying these missions over and over and over again to the same factory, unable to knock it out, risking their lives, all of that. And that leads to the demoralization of your men.
Well, and then you talk about Curtis LeMay. General Curtis LeMay comes through, and he's kind of one of those General Grant guys, if I can jump back to the Civil War. Somebody who's going to adapt, and also, just in his outlook, he has a brutal outlook. Not necessarily, I think, sadistic or anything like that, but as you just mentioned, war's hell, and if we're going to do it, we've got to do it and end it as quickly as possible. Am I summing him up right? What do you think?
One of the great things about the story is I think you do have these two very fascinating individuals, because LeMay is everything Hansel is not. Hansel he grew up in an army aristocratic family. His father was a doctor. His family had served in every war going all the way back to pretty much the beginning of the United States. And so, he was a product of all that, whereas Lemay was the complete opposite. I mean, Lemay had grown up dirt poor in Ohio. His mother had an 8th grade education. She was the highest education in his family. His father had sort of just suffered through a bunch of menial jobs and bounced the family all around the country. And Lemay had learned at a very young age that he could rely only on himself. He couldn't even rely on his parents. And so he had a very difficult childhood. I mean, in fact, he writes later on that, that there probably were nights when he would have lied and awake in bed and stared at the ceiling and thought how exhausted he was from working all the time and trying to get through school. But he was just too tired to even care. So he didn't play sports. He didn't date. He didn't have any friends, really. I mean, even when he goes to college, the only way he's able to pay for it is by working all night long in a steel mill, just to be able to, and so he's literally around the clock awake, steel mill, school, all that. So that sort of school of hard knocks makes him this total pragmatist. But he's also an engineer, and his background training is in engineering and whatnot. So he's a problem solver. And so he brings a brutal pragmatism and a mind oriented toward problem solving to everything he does. And so that when he takes over in the Mariana Islands from Hansel, they knew each other. That's the thing that's fascinating, is they both knew each other, and not well, but in fact, Hansel had been Lemay's boss when they were in Europe. In fact, when I was going through Lemay's extensive personal papers, I found where Hansel actually written a letter of commendation for him, because of how hard Lemay had worked. And at that time, Hansel outranked him. And when Lemay shows up in the Pacific, he now outranks Hansel, and he's replacing him. And Hansel grabs him when they first reconnect, and he says to him, and this is important to him, he says, Lemay, at this point, America knew we were eventually going to win this war. He says, look, we're not going to be judged by, whether we win the war, as we are. We're going to be judged by how we win the war. And he's encouraging Lemay to keep with his plan of this strategic bombing, this precision bombing. And Lemay, to his credit, initially tries. A lot of people say, well, Lemay immediately takes over and changes everything. And that's simply not true. I mean, the historical record shows that Lemay takes over and he tries to do what Hansel did. And he runs into the same problems, the jet streams, the cloud cover and all this. And he tinkers with he brings the bombers down to a lower altitude. He changes the takeoff times. I mean, he tries to solve the equation that had eluded Hansel. And he eventually realizes it's unsolvable. And so he has to then decide, okay, what am I going to do to make this work? Because there's tremendous pressure at this point on Lemay, just like there was on Hansel, to hurry up and end this war. And to end it by air power. Because if you can't bomb Japan to its knees, then hundreds of thousands of American troops are going to have to slosh ashore, and they're going to have to battle the Japanese block by block through Tokyo, Nagoya, and everywhere else. And we had already seen what that story looks like. I mean, we had just taken Manila in February, March of 1945. We had seen how bloody and awful an urban fight could be. And all of that hung over them. Hey, we got to find a way to break Japan before we have to risk hundreds of thousands of American lives. And so, of course, that's all weighing on top of Curtis Lemay at that point as well. And that's when after he's exhausted all other possibilities, that's when he makes this decision. All right, we're going to switch from precision bombing and we're going to go to firebombing.
Now, you throw a wrench in the argument you just made about how it's going to be brutal and bloody. And the most eye-opening aspect of this book was when you talked about what life was like on the home islands at this point in the war, because we were all fed what you just said, right? That the Japanese are never going to give up. It's going to be block by block. You're going to have to basically kill everyone in Japan to take over Japan. What's it actually like in Tokyo, in these other cities at this point in the war?
Yeah, and that's something that you don't see a lot in the literature, and that I really tried to layer into this book a lot from Japanese sources, is what was life like in Tokyo at that time? Because people have a real idea of what Tokyo, they think of Tokyo today, and you think of steel and glass high rises, and you think of sort of the wealth and the modernity of it, and and that's not how it was at all at that time period. I mean, Tokyo was largely 1- and 2-story wooden buildings. It had a sort of a handful of sort of taller brick buildings, like a business commercial district, but it was almost like a Hollywood backdrop. And the majority of the people there lived in more traditional housing, the same kind of stuff you would have found in a century earlier. And of course, the war had taken a huge toll on Japan. I mean, it's an island nation. It's been blockaded highly successfully by the American submarine force. Incidentally, there's a great book called The War Below, which I happen to have written a few years ago on that topic. By this point in the war, I mean, the Japanese public is suffering tremendously. You know, their food is getting scarce. The daily caloric intake of people is plummeting. The black market is thriving. You can't get basic medicines and things like that. I mean, a lot of new mothers are so malnourished, they can't even nurse their newborns. So, and of course, you know, so there's this massive struggle on the home front for your average civilians there. And then on top of all this, you add firebombing in the cities and the destruction of the cities. And so it really, it's life is difficult for the civilians in Japan at this point.
Even the emperor is starting to say, like, hey, I think this is going a bad way. This was not a country that was, we're going to all fight to the death. A lot of people, including the emperor, are starting to say, well, we might be hosed here.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think the writing was kind of on the wall. I mean, Japan's economy by the summer of 1944 really kind of goes over the apex and sort of begins its death spiral. But by early January of 1945, you know, they make this decision that it is going to be that they're going to husband all their resources, and that there's going to be one great battle for the homeland. And you know, they start training children and grandmothers to use spears and everything. And so, I mean, there really is this idea that there's going to be this just fight to the death. And of course, we had seen that, and not just in places like Manila, but I mean, just taking the Mariana Islands. You know, we had seen, you know, the largest banzai charge of the war had taken place there. You know, you saw women and children, you know, wading out into the sea and jumping into the ocean. And so, I mean, we knew that fanaticism was there, and that it was something we potentially would have to go up against. And so, but you're right. But by the summer of 45, I mean, you really do see the emperor at that point realizing, hey, the cities are being burned and everything else. We've got to start figuring out a way to end this. But the Japanese had this really outdated idea that if they could just get this one more victory, it would give them a better bargaining chip at the surrender table. And they kept holding out. And of course, those victories were never going to come. I mean, you know, America had them blockaded and then were bombing them and whatnot. But of course, that was the goal of the emperor and his folks, because they were desperately trying to protect the royal family and to continue that, you know, the emperor's dynasty. And so all of that then comes at the great sacrifice of the people of Tokyo and all the other Japanese cities.
So summing up the philosophical points here is Hansel wants to go in high. It keeps his planes more safe. You can bomb from the sky. There wasn't really an argument that we don't have to bomb, but his thinking was more precision bombing and things like that. Lemay comes in and says, this isn't working because, first of all, the weather over Japan, apparently a lot of clouds. I remember that part.
Yeah.
He's like, we got to come in low. We got to come in hard. And this is something that you point out. In Japan, if you're a regular person, you were probably creating something for the war effort. Maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe it's some clothes or something like that. And the argument is the entire country is part of the war effort. It's part of the war machine, which means we've got to bomb everything. And not necessarily totally indiscriminately, but you're dropping bombs on fire. And like you said, it's wood. When you're proposing that philosophical question, how do you go about even doing it? Do you just say, I got to put all the evidence out there and let the reader kind of get to it? Or do you have it in your mind and how you want to kind of present it?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, you know, one thing it's important for us to back up just a touch too, because, you know, Lemay gets all the credit for being the one who sort of, you know, reimagines how America can bomb Japan. But the reality is, I mean, the path to firebombing Japan had begun long before Curtis LeMay first gets off that plane on Guam in early 1945. I mean, in fact, it really begins at the outbreak of the war when America is, you know, looking at what's going on in Europe and thinking, hey, we need to come up with some new flame weapons. And so they start designing and figuring out you know, what would be an ideal incendiary weapon, of course. And that's where the creation of napalm comes in, you know, and it's tested right there on the campus at Harvard and Cambridge, Massachusetts. At the same time, you're developing sort of the technology, the flame technology, you know, the ordnance. War planners start looking at Japan's weaknesses. And of course, the big Achilles heel for Japan is its vulnerability to fire. And, you know, we forget about it now because it's all these years later. But I mean, Tokyo suffered a tremendous fire in Yokohama in 1923 in the aftermath of the big earthquake. And so much of Tokyo and Yokohama literally burned up at that time. And you have to remember, by 1945, That's not even 2 decades earlier. So everybody would remember that. And so the United States war planners are looking at that and being like, how do we replicate that? And so, in fact, so they start studying the vulnerability of Japan's key cities and putting together these basically city dossiers that Lemay eventually uses that break down city ward by city ward based on density, population density, construction materials, things like that. They even brought in some of the insurance adjusters that had worked in Tokyo, for like foreign companies and stuff like that, to sort of consult with them. And these were the insurance adjusters in the wake of the 1923 fire, to sort of consult with them on sort of why it burned and how it burned. And then so we take all this, and then we actually had engineers to go out in the deserts of Utah and construct a mock Japanese village in the summer of 1943 at Dugway Proving Ground that over that summer we burned down over and over and over again, just to figure out, we built these mock village all the way down to using tatami mats and the same type of materials and things like that, just to be able to test it all. So when Lemay takes over, it's not as radical of a change is often viewed, because Lemay is just everything he needs to do this has already been tested. It's already been demonstrated, and he just has to pick and do it. And so there was this huge inertia pushing America in this direction. And Lemay is just the one who basically decides to do it, so to speak. But the pressure was already there. And had Lemay not been able to do it, and I've had this great conversation with Rich Frank, who's one of the best World War II historians in the world, and a great friend. And Rich always makes the point, I think he's absolutely right here, that if Lemay hadn't done it, they would have just fired him and brought in somebody else that was willing to do it, because the inertia was there to begin. The patience was not going to last for America to go for years and years of pinpoint bombing to try to do it. I mean, the war in Germany wraps up, in the spring of 45. There's war fatigue. There's all this kind of stuff. There's all this money's being spent. That America was going to just head down this path one way or the other, whether it was Lemay or not.
And it's important to remember, you do point out that there are some people starting to ask these moral questions, but anyone, honestly, who talks to somebody who was alive during this time, they're still pissed about Pearl Harbor sometimes. Like, this was a formative event. And at this point, even in the war, there was no talk about morals or anything like that. It was win the war, beat the Japanese. This is what they did. They did a sneak attack on us. They get what they get. And some people are starting to ask these moral questions, but for the most part, people are silent about it. Just get this war over with, right?
Yeah, those voices are few and far between. In fact, when Lemay first flies that first mission against Tokyo in March of 1945, the Air Force is very concerned about what the public outcry is going to be. And so they're monitoring the editorial pages and the radio broadcasts. And paying attention to this to see, is there going to be some kind of great, huge pushback? And you have to remember, Dresden's taken place literally just a few weeks before this. So it's like, you've got, and of course there was this huge outcry in the aftermath of Dresden, and so of course America's paying attention to all that. And so Lemay burns down Tokyo, and he gets orders sent to him from Washington about guard against people trying to say that you're firebombing. This is really, you're going after industry and all that, which is true, but you're going after industry with a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel, so to speak. But they're stunned. There isn't that pushback. In fact, Time magazine comes out and says, properly kindled Japanese cities will burn like the autumn leaves. And that lack of pushback really serves as a green light. And so Lemay just keeps on hitting and punching and punching and punching. And for the next several months, he goes after Tokyo multiple times. He ultimately hits Tokyo a total of 6 times, burns 56 square miles of Tokyo. Goes after Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe, all the major cities. And then he moves on to the secondary and even tertiary cities. And at that point, it does begin to change, because while Tokyo does have a legitimate military element to it, literally about 50% of Tokyo's industrial production was coming out of these cottage industries. By the end of the war, they're burning down cities that have, and towns really, towns as small as like 30, 35, 40,000 people that don't have any real military value. They're running out of targets. They're just bombing anything they can. And so it does begin to become more of terror bombing at that point.
Now, I normally hate asking speculative questions when we're talking about history. Alternate history, usually I hate it, but I've got somebody who knows World War II like the back of his hand, especially the Pacific Theater, so I got to take my shot here. Is there value to these firebombings up until Fat Man and Little Boy drop and end the war? Are we talking about a different end to the war if Hansel keeps bombing the way he did and then we drop the atomic bombs? What do you think? Total conjecture.
Yeah, it would have gone on and on, no doubt about it, because the reality is the precision bombing simply wasn't working, and it wasn't really having any kind of real impact on industry, the public, morale, or any of that. I mean, truth be told, I mean, the submarine war really is what accomplishes the most damage to the Japanese by just cutting off their imports and cutting off largely oil. I mean, the whole reason that the Japanese were using kamikazes is because they didn't have enough fuel to train pilots. I mean, their battleships were parked in port, relegated to anti-aircraft duty. I mean, they were struggling to import enough food. I mean, rice was rotting on the docks in Korea. I mean, so the submarine war, even before the first B-29 takes off in November 1944, has really pretty much demolished Japan. And say, but it's hard to visualize what a submarine blockade does. And that's where the firebombing comes in, because you can visualize, Japanese residents can see burned houses and bloated bodies in rivers and destroyed city blocks and things like that. So it really hammers home the defeat more than just being hungry and not being able to get the things you need to. So it's really, it's this compounding misery that is then layered on top of the Japanese. And that's what I do think Lemay accomplishes there. The challenge, of course, is that, look, if Japan were a normal society, your citizens would have risen up and revolted and put an end to the war, but they're not. I mean, it's a democracy in name only, and so most of the people are, if you speak out, you're going to get arrested. I mean, it's the same kind of thing that happened in Germany, and that's again where the American naivete about like, hey, if we just make it miserable, the people will rise up against their government. Well, I mean, you speak out, you get shot. You speak out, you go to jail. And so it's like, it's not that easy. And that's how these miserable situations continue on and on and on. So, but there's no doubt. I mean, Hirohito goes out into the ruins after Tokyo is burned, so that Lemay's big strike burns 16 square miles, kills 100,000 people. I mean, it's just devastating. And he goes out afterwards and he sees it. And it's the first time he's actually been outside of the palace since October of 44. And it's stunning. And this continues to go on and on. And it does eventually prompt him in June of 45 to say to his leaders, like, we got to figure out another way out of this war, because we're obviously not going to win it, like a diplomatic way out. But of course, Hirohito's weak. And his protests don't really go anywhere, and it's sort of half-hearted, so to speak. And so the Lemay keeps burning. And then you have, July of 45 in the deserts southwest, Trinity explodes. And next thing you know, you got the Indianapolis, and it's crossing the Pacific. And then you've got Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so it's just this tidal wave of events that just crashed right over Japan in those last 6 or 8 weeks of the war that they find themselves, they're just having to react to. I mean, they're not being proactive, they're reactive.
The craziest fact that you threw out there that I absolutely had no idea about. Yep, a lot of Tokyo was burned except the Imperial Palace. It was off limits for bombing, which I think at this point, now looking back, you say, are you insane? But that was an actual order. Don't bomb the palace where the emperor is at.
Yeah, and that order actually was the same. Jimmy Doolittle gave that same order back in 1942 when he flew the Doolittle raid. I mean, and the idea behind that is you because the emperor was so central to sort of the political spiritual life of the Japanese culture, this killing him or burning up the imperial palace could have the opposite effect. I mean, it could actually make people rally around the emperor instead of drive people apart. And so the idea with the bombing is that you want to turn people against their government, not make them rally around it. Now, later in the war, of course, the fires they spread and they do burn part of the palace, but not intentionally. But yeah, exactly. In fact, the palace was actually one of the sort of the boundary areas. So when Lemay was bombing Tokyo, they basically had this rectangle, this 12 square mile area over the city of the densest part of Tokyo, and the Imperial Palace was sort of the bottom left corner of that rectangle. So that way, I guess the idea being that he can have a front row seat to the inferno.
You mentioned the Doolittle raid. I think I remember reading a really good book on that. I forget the author's name. But
it's a fantastic book on that, man. Best book you'll ever read. I would tell people, yeah. I can't remember that guy's name, but Target Tokyo, and Google it, find it, buy it.
Yeah, I think it was up for a bunch of awards or something. Yeah, go on Amazon, Target Tokyo, see if you can find it. All right, I have a question that I've been waiting years to ask. How are the lime trees in the yard? Are they still doing well? And am I still invited over for porch drinking?
Absolutely. Yeah. Porch drinking whenever you want, come on by. I did have one tragedy this summer. We were out of town for 2 weeks and my smallest, newest lime bush, I think it got burned down. Look, in Charleston, South Carolina, it's 100 degrees, and it's just, and I wasn't here to water it. But I've already been calling around trying to get a replacement. The other 3 are going strong. I'll have cocktails, homegrown limes here within the next month, hopefully. So
perfect. I'll get ready. We'll figure something out. Last question, right? Reason why this started, History Nerds United, it started because people say, I don't want to read history. It's boring, right? One of those people's in front of you and they say, why should I read Black Snow? History is boring. What's your answer?
And I'll tell you, sadly, there is a lot of boring history out there. And I think the challenge that every historian faces is how do you tell your story in such a way that it's engaging? And I compare history to feeding vegetables to my children. If you make them eat broccoli, they'll hate it. But if you put cheese on that broccoli, it's awesome. And I think if you can tell history in a narrative, engaging way by focusing on characters like Lemay and Hansel and focusing on these pivotal moments like the firebombing of Tokyo, you can write it like a thriller. And some of the best history out there is written that way. And so I think that's the key is finding those great books and finding them, find those writers, follow them, read them. There's plenty of them out there.
And Black Snow is one of them, out September 6th as of right now. Well, James, once again, another thrill. Thank you so much. I'm going to hold your spot for the next book.
Brendan, thanks so much for having me on. Always a pleasure.
And that's it for this episode. James, thank you so much for coming on. Black Snow, out September 6th. It's a fantastic book, everybody. I would not lie to you. Go out and get it as soon as it comes out. You will not regret it. In the meantime, check us out online, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Head on over to the blog. Listen to more podcast episodes. Leave ratings for us. Hopefully 5 stars, please. Other than that, use our Amazon link if you're going out to buy anything. Doesn't cost you anything. It's just a couple of clicks. Helps us out a lot. In the meantime, take it easy, nerds.